The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene has been a widely influential book, and I'm going to take a deep dive and a close analysis of this book. Having a background in behavioral science myself for over 12 years and having published in the field, I'm going to take a look at whether it's really worth the hype or whether there are some issues with it, and ultimately whether it's really worth reading or not. So let's dive into it. So the first law we want to take a look at is people are self-absorbed. And this is a claim. So each law is a claim, and it's a law in the book. There are 18 laws spelled out in this book, and each one is basically a claim. And I'm going to evaluate each of these claims. And I have my trusty stylus here to help us here. So we have this claim, and basically we want to talk about some understanding of what this is actually saying in the first place. So people are self-absorbed. What does that really mean? I think what Robert Greene seems to mean by this is people are kind of like ego-centered, right? Ego-centered and focused on themselves. And recent research in the behavioral sciences, I would say in the past decade or so, has really focused on understanding different motivations of people, and has really found that people are not only self-interested, they're both altruistic and self-interested. But very interestingly, I would like to just even go a little bit deeper and talk about the genetic components of this as well, because where we see the truth of this, whether this is true or not, is really in, I believe, the biological sciences. Richard Dawkins actually has some really good work, and in his The Selfish Gene, really great book, by the way, The Selfish Gene, and I'll just write it out here, in his The Selfish Gene. So The Selfish Gene by Dawkins, right? By Richard Dawkins, he discusses the reality that in terms of genetic the population and genetics in a population, genes are the ones that are kind of motivated, so to speak, for lack of a better word, to survive, right? It is not the individuals. It is not necessarily even just particular groups of the species. It's really the gene itself that is primed for survival. So what does that imply? So according to Dawkins, we and many other researchers, there is a mixture of there is a mixture of altruistic individuals in a species group, and that includes humans, and there's a mixture of self-interested individuals in a species group, and then there's something in between, right? A mixture. Many of them are in a species group are in between, and we have to actually achieve some sort of equilibrium, or a species has to achieve some sort of equilibrium between selfish individuals and altruistic individuals in order for the species to survive. And why? What's a good example? Well, if you can imagine, some species, and even humans, right, many times sacrifice their own life for, let's say, children or the next generation. And you'd think about that, well, why wouldn't people then be self-absorbed, right? Why would they care about themselves? Why wouldn't they care about themselves? Well, do you see how that's not very adaptive, right? To just care about yourself. So if that were true, that humans were only self-absorbed and ego-centered, we would not have survived as long as we did. In fact, there are many species of hominids that have gone extinct that one of the biggest hypotheses in actually anthropology, biological anthropology, evolutionary science, is that humans evolved and adapted this cooperative structure, or these cooperative tendencies, and that's why we survived. That's one reason we survived over, for instance, Neanderthals. So it is a really important thing to note. So people are self-absorbed. It's really not totally true. I think we can even know that from example, personal experience, but that's not enough. We need evidence. But so basically he has no evidence for this law number one. Let's look at law number two. I'm not going to talk about all the laws here. I'm picking out a few key ones. So people are grandiose. Let's talk about this as well. There's also very little evidence for this. I know you might think in your daily life, well, yeah, I have a really horrible boss or somebody who's really a narcissist, like literally a narcissist. Yes, these people exist. These people exist for sure. But what is he saying here? What is his claim? His claim is something along the lines of what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is essentially the idea or a concept in psychology that people tend to overestimate their abilities or skills. And this is particularly the case with respect to this effect with respect to intelligence. People tend to think they're smarter than they are, right? This was something that was come up with, studied, I should say, in or discovered, so to speak, in the 90s. There was a study that was done in the 90s and that observed this Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, I see this idea everywhere on YouTube and on social media, but what most people don't mention is Dunning-Kruger effect has actually been debunked, right? There are many follow-up studies that, right, and I'll just put this here. This is debunked. There are many, many follow-up studies that have shown that the Dunning-Kruger effect is not reproducible, right? It's yes, do people overestimate their abilities and so forth? Yes, it's true. But do they do it in a statistically significant way? Is this like, for instance, is somebody who are people who have less ability more likely on average to overestimate their ability? It's actually not true. Sometimes it's true, but it's not true to a statistically significant degree. So this claim really doesn't hold water either. In fact, there are other models in social cognitive theory and so forth that show probably that this doesn't hold water for sure. So law number 2 doesn't really hold water. So law number 3, people can be influenced. This is absolutely true. And of course, people can be influenced. But essentially, his ideas here are a little bit incomplete. So he has 3 central claims in this book about how people can be influenced, and I'm going to write these out. So one is he talks about flattering people's insecurities. So actually, I'm going to type this out instead. So he talks about, because it's faster, flattering people's insecurities. So let's talk about what that means. So flattering people's insecurities, by saying that, like, for instance, if somebody is insecure about their looks, let's say they're insecure about their intelligence, well, compliment them on how intelligent they are, compliment them on how beautiful they are, whatever. And that is a way of influencing people, he states. It can be, but there can also be, if you're really disingenuous about it, if you're really not genuine about it, people can sense that as well. So it's not, we'll talk about how people can be influenced, but this way is a little bit shaky. He talks about other ways to influence people, and, number 2 is listening deeply. Now, this definitely is a way of influencing people in general. If you can listen to them, repeat back what they're saying, show that you're engaging with what they're saying, they're more likely to listen to you. That's absolutely true and shown. Or asking for advice, right? So this is another way, number 3, and I'm not lining these up very well, but it's okay. Number 3 is asking for advice. So if you ask for advice, it can actually be sort of a compliment. Like, oh, you're asking me for advice. It's, that means you think a lot of me. And this is actually valid. This is very valid. So this is called the Benjamin Franklin effect, in fact. And I can't remember if he actually mentions the Benjamin Franklin effect in the book or not, if he names it by name. But this is the Benjamin Franklin effect. And this comes from the idea that Benjamin Franklin, a long time ago, he wanted to gain some influence with a political rival. I hope I'm getting this story straight. I think it was a political rival. And he said, can I borrow a book from your library? And that helped build the relationship because it showed apparently that Benjamin Franklin had some high respect for this person, and that made the person feel good and trust Franklin. So that is definitely valid, and that has been shown to be a valid concept, right? That actually happens. So this is correct. However, if you want to know how people can be influenced, I would suggest checking out. There's some better work out there in terms of more comprehensive strategies and tactics on how to influence and be persuasive. That's more evidence-based and scientific by Robert Cialdini. So there's a great book out there called Influence by Robert Cialdini. And actually, it's actually scientific research, which unlike Greene's work is not scientific at all. It's just kind of assertions, and we'll get to the problems that I have generally with his book shortly. So, but let's move on to the next topic. So the next one is people are aggressive, and people are aggressive. Well, that is. There's not a lot of evidence for this either. And you'd say, well, there's not a lot of evidence for people are aggressive. What are you talking about? Well, the thing is that this is making a claim that people are innately aggressive. Yes, people have, if we look at history, obviously, it's a lot of our history, a lot of the history of the world is basically war, and more violence. Sure. But although we have aggressive tendencies, we also have non-aggressive tendencies. And it's actually good from an evolutionary standpoint, obviously, to be aggressive and have aggressive tendencies. But it's too generic, and it insists or it suggests what I have a problem with here is the claim suggests that it's innate. Right? And why do I have a problem with that? Because in general, basically social scientists, neuroscientists, let's get down to the nervous system level, don't really talk about something as innate. There's always an interplay between environment and even gene interaction. How a gene expresses itself many times can results in a biological reaction, which then can result in a behavioral outcome. And how the gene is expressed can also be dependent on an environment. In fact, let's talk about the research, right? In the 1960s, right? The researcher Albert Bandura had a series of studies. It was called the Bobo doll experiment. You can find this online. And the Bobo doll experiment actually showed, although there were some issues with the study, yes, but even subsequent studies also confirmed that a lot of our aggressive behavior is learned. They actually had children involved in the study. It was controversial for that reason, because it was children observing adults engaging in aggressive behavior, and then they imitated the behavior. So people do tend to learn aggression, and they can actually turn off, you might say they're turning off a genetic switch in certain environments that don't promote aggression. So it's hard to actually innately say that. We've actually observed cultures that are fairly non-aggressive, and then we've observed cultures that are, you'd say, are hyper-aggressive. Sparta, right? It's a good example. Hyper-aggressive. But we've also seen ones that are not very aggressive. And an environment does tend to play a huge role in that. Also, social expectations and social norms play a role. So this claim also does not hold water, unfortunately. So we're on to Law 8, and people's individuality is overpowered by groups. Now, this is definitely true. It can be true. And there are actually many theories. Let's discuss here theories of social conformity. Now, there are some really fascinating studies out there, right? You talk about the Ash, I think it's Ash, hold on, Asch, ASCH, I believe, conformity experiment, if I'm spelling his name correctly. Anyway, Asch conformity experiment. And Solomon Asch, decades ago, ran a study showing that people who, are in a group of people, and they're asked, well, compare this line, the length of this line on a piece of paper to, the other lines on the other piece of paper, and tell me which one is the same length, right? Take a look at the two lines, and tell me if they're the same length, right? And people who are paid as kind of actors to be study participants alongside the person, or act as study participants alongside the person, will tell you that, they act as if, they're not the same length. So this person's just trying to strain, right? So we have these two lines, and right, they're the same. You've got like maybe three other lines, and they tell you, well, these two, people keep saying, well, these two are the same length. So the person's trying to strain and say, well, those two are the same length, huh? And then when it comes around to them to answer, more often than not, people will actually answer, yes, these are the same length, because the rest of the group is saying that. So they must feel that I must be wrong. My perception must be wrong. So actually, our group influence can affect our, yes, it could be that I feel pressure to conform. That's true. But it can also affect our perception, literally affect our perception. And we think something is true just because the group says it. So it is very powerful. And so we have to understand some of these theories. But we can overcome it. Knowing these things, we can overcome it. So this law number 8 is pretty good, is actually fairly true, but we have to learn to overcome these influences. So next is law number 11. Yeah, law number 11. People are irrational. So let's talk about how this is actually true. It's partially true, I would say. Partially true and somewhat false. So again, it's a very general statement, but so in decision theory, let's talk about decision theory for a moment, which is a subset of my field of value theory. So decision theory is, as it sounds, how people make decisions, how people should make decisions, and how people should sort of order their preferences in order to make those decisions. So there's a whole theory out there, decision theory, about this, and a subcomponent of decision theory is rational choice theory, or rational decision theory, right? Same thing. So rational choice theory, this is kind of the dominant model in economics, or has been for a while. Economics uses a lot of rational choice theory to say, okay, well, people are rational actors, and that's how economies run. They make rational decisions based on their own self-interest, etc. And it's used in economics, a lot of the social sciences, and so on and so forth. The problem is, in a field called neuroeconomics actually came along, and it's kind of not that old. It's a kind of a young field that came along, and researchers in this field said, hey, wait, let's test rational choice theory. We have to actually test it empirically in the real world. And what, as neuroeconomists, as well as other behavioral scientists, tested this theory, they found, yeah, actually people don't behave according to rational choice theory. People don't actually always follow their preferences. People don't actually act in their self-interest. People don't make judgments of, they don't maximize utility, right? That's another term. The idea is they do something called maximize utility, right? Go with the best option that's going to increase the value for you, increase the return for you. So people don't, by and large, in some ways they act like this way, but in many ways they don't. And so we've had to actually go back and revise these this idea. And a really good hypothesis here for of how to think about rationality is this, what's called the social brain hypothesis. So rationality, instead of being an individual thing, our brains have actually developed and adapted so that the best reasoning and the best rational decision making actually happens within groups. Why? There's actually some good evidence and some good evidentiary support of this. But why? Because the brain uses a lot of energy. Actually, the brain uses a lot of energy to just operate, and a lot of calories. And the more energy it's using, the less energy it has for things like, hunting, right, and gathering, and protection from wild animals and things like that. And that's the environment that we grew up in, that we evolved in, right? And so our brains are still this way. And so reasoning by ourselves and making rational judgments, physics and math and logic, these things are not really things that are, evolutionarily speaking, worthwhile, right? From an evolutionary perspective, they're not, we're not adapted to think about those things very easily. But in a group setting, the reason that the brain, this hypothesis basically states that the reason the brain developed the way it did at all, with the ability to do logic, math, and physics, etc., and reasoning, is to actually cooperate better as a group. For humans to cooperate better as a group. When we can reason to each other and fix each other's assumptions and fix each other's reasoning, one, it offloads a lot of that brain energy that would have been consumed by the brain. It offloads it to the group, right? It disperses the energy used for decision making and for reasoning. And so that's kind of what's the moral of the story here? It actually, don't try to make rational decisions by yourself. Don't try to think about rational, reason things out always by yourself. Get in a group setting, discuss it, interact. Usually you're going to have more ideas, and better solutions than you would by yourself. In fact, that's how we were adapted. That's how we've adapted to best function. So it makes sense to do that. So what do I think in general of Greene's work here? Well, there are two. Is it a worthwhile read? Yeah, of course. I like to read books in any case, right? But I have a few problems with it. So I have two major problems. So one is it is a scientific book, right? He says it's laws of human nature. But if you're going to say that something is about the laws of human nature, you better be able to defend it scientifically, because it's a scientific claim that these are laws of human nature. No citation. So that's the problem. No citations, right? No citations, no scientific citations, no studies that are cited. And that is kind of my real problem with it, because, you're making big claims here, right? So that can't be substantiated. He only uses historical examples. So, and what's wrong with historical examples? You might say, well, it's fine, historical examples. Well, what's the real problem with historical examples only is that when we have only historical examples, you can cherry pick data that easily, right? You can cherry pick, this example and this example and this example in history prove my point. Well, I could do the same thing to disprove your point. That's the point. I could find lots of examples in history and lots of cases and lots of stories that would equally disprove your point. So that's not reliable, just historical examples. The other problem I have with it is, I was alluding to it before, is just the idea of human behavior. Just the idea of laws of human behavior. Or I would say more like human nature in the first place. For how many centuries and how many thousands of years have people been wondering, well, what is really human nature? What is the nature of human nature? And the more I even think back to when I was in my grad program, and I talked to my neuroscience, my neuroendocrinology professor at the time, and I had this question to her: hey, what about the influence of nature versus nurture, right? In a nervous system, right? And she explained to me pretty calmly, neuroscientists don't really think that way, right? There is no, we don't think about human nature, or those weren't the words that she used, but she said we don't think about nature versus nurture. There's just a system. There's just a system that exists. Environment, genes, biology, it's a continuum. There isn't a clear dividing line between them. It's a continuum. And it's all a bunch of interacting features or interacting systems. And so it doesn't really even make sense to talk about human nature. There isn't really truly a human nature. There are humans in certain environments and certain contexts with certain backgrounds and whatever, and there are others in other contexts. And that is the case. There are certain things that stay constant, right? Genetics, certain genetics that does stay constant and tends to produce certain outcomes, for sure, biological realities. But even biological realities often aren't fixed. We have epigenetics, for instance, that can where that shows the gene expression even isn't fixed. So in many cases, so in a lot of cases, so this is his book, Human Nature, Laws of Human Nature. And if you really want to dig deep and really increase your critical thinking skills and understand these things at a deeper level, check out my free masterclass in the pinned comment below and the description below. And I will see you in the next video.